Y'all ready for this? Let's go.
Hello and welcome to the Ben James Smith podcast. Today we're going to talk about something that on the surface appears to be geopolitical news, but beneath that has direct implications for property markets and capital flows. Over the past few days, the world has watched escalating tensions in the Middle East, including reports of Iranian strikes impacting the UAE and rising concerns about regional stability. Whenever events like this happen, most of the discussion focuses on diplomacy, military escalation, or energy prices. But there is another dimension that receives far less attention, and that is how geopolitical instability moves people and capital. Because when uncertainty rises in one region of the world, money rarely disappears. It relocates, and historically one of the places it often relocates to is the United Kingdom. So today we're going to explore how geopolitical tension can affect property markets, why capital often seeks safe haven assets during periods of instability, and why residential property in stable, legal jurisdictions tends to benefit from global uncertainty. Part 1. Capital always moves towards stability. One of the most important things to understand about global capital is that it is constantly searching for two things: return and safety. But when uncertainty increases, safety becomes the dominant priority. Investors may accept lower returns if they believe the environment protecting their capital is stronger. And that's where political stability, legal frameworks, and property rights start to matter enormously. The UK has historically been one of the world's preferred destinations for safe haven capital, not necessarily because returns are the highest, but because the institutional framework around ownership is predictable, strong property rights, independent courts, clear legal structures. These characteristics are often taken for granted domestically, but globally they are extremely valuable because capital does not simply seek opportunity, it seeks protection. Part 2. The expat migration dynamic. Now let's look at a specific mechanism that can affect the UK property market. Migration patterns. Over the past decades, and especially since the pandemic, large numbers of British professionals have relocated to the Middle East, particularly Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Many were drawn by tax advantages, lifestyle, and economic opportunity. Dubai in particular has become one of the world's fastest growing expatriate hubs. But geopolitical shocks change risk perception. And when risk perception changes, migration patterns can reverse. If a significant number of British expatriates decide that the region feels less stable, well, even temporarily, some will return to the UK. Now it's important not to exaggerate this effect. Not everyone leaves, and migration decisions take time. But even relatively small shifts can influence housing demand in specific segments of the market, particularly London rental markets, prime residential areas, family housing in commuter belts, because returning expatriates often bring both capital and urgency to secure accommodation. They are not starting from scratch, they are re-entering the market, and that can create sudden pockets of demand. Part 3. Safe haven property markets. This phenomenon is not new. In fact, if you look at global property cycles over the last 2 decades, geopolitical instability has repeatedly redirected capital into stable real estate markets. During the Arab Spring, capital flowed into London property. During periods of instability in Russia, we saw significant Russian investment into Western real estate. During uncertainty in Hong Kong, capital moved into the UK, Canada, and Australia, and the pattern is always the same. When uncertainty rises locally, capital internationalizes. Investors diversify geographically to reduce political exposure. Residential property in politically stable countries becomes a store of value, not just a yield investment, but a security asset. That's why prime residential markets in cities like London, New York, and Singapore often behave differently to purely domestic housing markets. They are influenced by global capital movement, not just local supply and demand. Part 4. The other side of the equation. Of course, geopolitical tension doesn't only influence migration and capital flows, it also affects the global economic environment. Energy markets are particularly sensitive to Middle East instability. Oil prices can rise, inflation expectations can shift. Central banks may become more cautious about cutting interest rates, and this matters because interest rates directly influence mortgage affordability. So while geopolitical events may increase capital inflows into certain property markets, they can simultaneously create economic headwinds. Higher energy prices feed into inflation. Higher inflation can slow monetary easing, and that can keep borrowing costs elevated. So, when analysing property markets, we need to recognise that multiple forces are operating at once. Capital movement may support demand, but macroeconomic conditions may affect affordability, and the balance between those two forces determines the net outcome. Part 5: Why residential property remains defensive. Despite these complexities, one thing remains remarkably consistent. Residential property has historically been one of the most resilient asset classes during periods of uncertainty. Why? Because housing demand is fundamentally human. People always need somewhere to live, and when geopolitical instability rises, that need becomes even more immediate. Individuals prioritize security, families prioritize stability, businesses prioritize predictable environments for employees. So, residential property, particularly in countries with strong institutions, tends to behave as a defensive asset, not immune to economic cycles, but supported by structural demand. This is why institutional investors increasingly allocate capital toward residential strategies, not only because of yield, but because of durability. Part 6: The broader lesson. Whenever geopolitical tension rises somewhere in the world, it reminds us of something important about capital markets. Money does not simply chase return, it chases stability. And stability is surprisingly rare. Strong legal frameworks, predictable regulation, reliable ownership rights. These are not universal, they are valuable infrastructure, and countries that provide them become natural destinations for global capital during uncertain periods. The UK historically has been one of those destinations, not because it is perfect, but because its institutions are trusted. So when we watch geopolitical events unfold, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, it's worth remembering that the consequences extend far beyond diplomacy and headlines. They influence migration, they influence capital allocation, and ultimately they influence property markets. Because real estate is not just about buildings, it is about where people choose to live and where they choose to store wealth. Thanks for listening. And remember, property markets are not only shaped by supply and demand, they are shaped by where the world feels safest placing capital. I'll see you in the next episode.